Next, let's look at my personal favorite aspect and the one I personally identify most with. Void is the idea of nothingness, or lack of something. To classify what void is exactly is no simple task, since to know and understand void is almost a contradictory idea. Void is the essence of what's unknowable, and ideas such as obfuscation and lack fall under the umbrella of what void can describe. For starters, void players seem to all have the shared trait of passively obfuscating themselves or information surrounding themselves towards would-be onlookers. Doc Scratch, a supposedly omniscient being, can't observe Equius or his ancestor Horus. This is used against him, as their proximity to the magic cue ball is what allows Vriska and her ancestor Rainia to hide it away from him. When trying to view someone that's surrounded by the void on various scattered terminals throughout the story, the viewer will instead see only a black screen. And then of course we also have the Ring of Void, which renders the wearer invisible and grants them the ability to banish objects into obscurity. Void players even seem compelled to do this type of obfuscation to themselves. Roxy struggles with alcoholism, obscuring her judgment, and Equius wears cracked sunglasses, obscuring his vision. You might be wondering if I'm going to start arguing that all of the aspects describe some idea in metafiction. The answer is yes, and I think that Void is probably the last one that I won't be getting much disagreement on. Whereas light players tend to take center stage, either purposefully hogging the spotlight or having a hard time staying out of it, Void players seem to be constantly chasing after it, and as a result are rarely the center of attention. Horus wields Void as a page, which is a class defined by having massive potential that's very hard to reach. Horus, despite trying incredibly hard to find some way of being useful or important, never quite gets there, and as a result has arguably the least influence on the story of any of the 34 kids. Equius, as the heir of Void, is an extremely interesting case. As the heir of Void, he has similar troubles with relevance as his ancestor, and the story's focus seems to go out of its way to avoid him. In his very first panel, in what should be his formal introduction page, the narrator is so completely repulsed by the sight of him that he hastily jumps away to a different character, only reluctantly coming back to him many pages later, and even then the story doesn't stick to him for very long. Despite having a particularly useful skill set just like his ancestor, the narrative seems to try and avoid directly showing us any of his major contributions, choosing instead to talk offhandedly about them. The narrative attempts to justify this by playing him off as someone who watches creepily from a distance, but I think there's a case to be made that this is actually the narrative attempting to keep its distance from him, much like a camera continually changes its focus. It raises an interesting question. Is it Equius' personality and mannerisms which keep him out of the focus, or is it his aspect? Are the aspects assigned to the characters, or chosen by them? Or is it something else entirely? In typical Voidy fashion, I'll leave you to ponder that for yourself for a while. Oh, and while I'm here, I guess I have to clarify something. I am aware that Equius is conceptually supposed to be an amalgamation of the more messed up things that Hussey's authored in the past, like Humanimals, and that the repulsion expressed in his introductory page is a nod to this. I find it sad that if I don't acknowledge that I know this, there will be people in the comments who say that I'm wrong to suggest that this treatment of Equius has anything to do with the void aspect because it so obviously has to do with this thing instead. But why instead? There could be more than one reason for something to happen in a story. Who's to say that Hussey didn't later decide that void was related to irrelevance specifically because of how he treated Equius prior? Suddenly something for which there was only one reason now has two. This doesn't even have anything to do with death of the author. Hussey told us one reason, but in saying that he didn't tell us that it wasn't possibly other reasons. These two things don't have to contradict each other. Anyway, with that out of the way, let's get back to what we were talking about. Equius dies early and seems to fall out of the story entirely, but I actually interpret this as an essential part of Equius fulfilling his mythological role. I interpret Equius' death as the moment where he truly fades into the background, fully inheriting his aspect, and even in death he continues to have a passive but nonetheless important influence on the events of the story. His blood is used by Gamzee to blot out certain spoilers in Rose's book so that Calliope doesn't know anything about Lord English, and in that way Equius is continuing to exert his influence as the embodiment of obfuscation. Later, when he's made into a sprite, he's asked what he plans to do in the final fight, and his response is one of my favorite lines in the story, simply because of how accurate it proves to be. I always wanted to do something really important and heroic, something quite grandiose and perfectly unmistakable as a gesture turning the tide of fortune for all of existence. I would like my gesture to shock everyone. It must come from out of the blue, make virtually no sense, stun all involved, and have a lasting, profoundly unintelligible impact on all future and pseudo-future events. This statement is perfectly in sync with what the contribution of an heir of void should look like. It's one that nobody, not even necessarily the author, reader, or even the heir himself, will ever be truly aware of or able to completely understand, but at the same time is impossible to ignore. Equius makes this contribution with a single brilliant action, when he shows up out of nowhere to hold Caliborn in place and in a heroic sacrifice has his soul trapped inside of Cal along with Caliborn, Dirk's autoresponder, and half of Gamzee. I think it's pretty clear from Doc Scratch's personality that Equius is in there somewhere, exerting his influence, along with Gamzee and the autoresponder. But what the hell does this mean? Is he the one creating the dark patches in Scratch's mind? How much does his personality factor into the way Scratch organizes his long con? He obviously has to have some influence, because the Gamzee part of him is presumably responsible for the strange influence of clowns on troll culture and the creation of his entire clown religions in the first place, and subsequently every instance of clown or harlequins in the entire story, making the entire clown aesthetic a giant ridiculous time loop, with the dark carnival imagery a recollection of Gamzee's memories on Caliborn's world. Right? Does Equius have a similar contribution? How closely intertwined is Equius with Lord English's mind after the break? Does English have void powers because of Equius? Does he have rage powers? Is having a supercomputer in his mind in the form of Dirk's autoresponder what allows Scratch to write the ATH code for English's entry? Is the autoresponder combined with god-tier time powers and the omniscience of the Green Sun sufficient enough qualifications for someone to create a trans-temporal chat client like Trollian? Does Dirk's autoresponder count as a splinter of the real Dirk? Does Lord English have heart powers? Are heart powers what allow English to transfer his soul at the execution of said ATH code? Can Lord English make splinters of himself? Is this the reason he is able to have incarnations in multiple universes at once like Arrhenius says? Are heart powers the reason why he's able to kill ghosts? Is Equius's presence in Lord English's psyche the reason why a magic cue ball, an object which possesses ultimate knowledge and enlightenment, is able to actually damage him? Is Equius the reason why we don't have clear answers to these questions? Is his presence here what's obfuscating this information from the readers? Is this a canonical way to excuse the author from explaining all these crazy-ass things explicitly? We'll never fully understand all the implications here, but the implications are all undeniably there. In this single moment, Equius fulfills his character arc as the heir of Void more successfully than anyone could have possibly anticipated, and probably more than anybody ever wanted. So far, we've talked about Void as describing the hiding of information and plot irrelevance. Void also describes submission, restraint, and uselessness. Equius puts on an act of being elitist and authoritative and is quick to give commands to those lower than him on the hemospectrum, but deep down he loves being subservient, with loves being a massive euphemism, and his struggles for relevance in Act 5 revolve around this. In this sense, his death can be viewed as a tragic failure. He had one last chance to take command of his own situation by just once not letting someone's will take precedence over his own, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. Horace, too, has a borderline fetishistic adoration of submitting to his superiors, and both of them seem to be dominated by negative emotions, which they'd go to great lengths to restrain themselves from showing. With his incredible strength, Equius has the habit of destroying everything he touches, rendering it useless. Because he breaks every weapon he touches, he's held back from using any strife specify other than his fists, and he can't even hold a glass of milk properly without crushing it. Horace, too, picks up dozens of skills and hobbies in the hopes that one of them might prove useful, but in his hands they're all rendered null and void. What I love about Void is specifically that last idea, uselessness. Void can easily be summed up with a single word, nothing. When Calliope and Jade make their way towards the Green Sun, she explains why the cracks in paradox space that Lord English is creating are so colorful. She implies then that the black canvas we typically see is actually a completely non-specific intermingling of all the aspects in equal measure, and that what we see as colorful cracks on that canvas is actually due to a disturbance in said uniformity. This seems to imply that all the aspects have an associated color, and that what we see as black in paradox space is actually the product of all these colors layered on top of one another. In Homestuck's finale, when the Green Sun collapses, it seems to suck in all of these colors, leaving nothing but white. This is the true color of Void. It's the non-color. We saw the same absence of color earlier in the story, actually, when John played the wind on his planet. He talks about it with Roxy. John says, "It's blank because it's nothing." And then Roxy replies, "Nothing? Why is it nothing? Where even are we?" To which John replies, "It's nothing because we are literally nowhere." And then Roxy, okay, how can you tell it's actually a field of nothingness, as opposed to just a bunch of regular empty space that happens to look vaguely neutral?" John says, "How can I tell? I guess I just can." That last distinction that Roxy makes between where they are and empty space is what I think comes closest to someone describing an aspect directly in the entire story. Whenever someone in Homestuck is asked to explain an aspect, you'll hear them attempt to do so by talking about the ideas that aspect describes, much like what I've been doing with these videos. Just as we can't view abstractions directly, we also can't easily talk about them. Leave it to a Void player to come the closest, though. With all this said, I think it might be a little more understandable why Void would be the hardest aspect to make an effective use out of. Many characters describe Void players as being able to perform acts which are nothing short of miraculous once they learn to wield it. However, getting there, and subsequently becoming relevant, is the hardest task a Void player faces. This struggle to make use of your strengths and talents is something that's emblematic of the Void aspect, and something that I personally relate to quite a bit. Let's finally turn to Roxy, the Rogue of Void. Roxy doesn't have quite as much trouble staying plot relevant as the other Void heroes, but she still has some. She makes an extremely heroic recovery from alcoholism immediately upon entering her session, which goes barely noticed by the narrative and really anyone besides Dirk, and she's the only one left out of the romantic drama that develops in her session. This is partially her own doing. She's shown to have a crush on Jake initially, but decides to allow Jane to make the move on him rather than pursuing it. Like Equius, she's showing restraint here, and letting the will of others take precedence over her own, albeit for more understandable and relatable reasons. She uses this to her advantage, though, as the neutrality that comes from not being involved allow her to take a leadership role and keep the group together where it would have otherwise fallen apart. As a Rogue of Void, Roxy is able to go invisible and use stealth at will, but more interestingly is able to use her powers to conjure objects out of thin air. According to Jade, Roxy does this by using her powers to rob nothingness from an idea. When she first tries to do this, she ends up creating a perfectly generic object. This happens because Roxy wasn't thinking of any particular idea when she used her power, and so what she ended up stealing was the generic placeholder for an idea, sort of like holding numbers as arbitrary by replacing them with letters in math. In order to master her powers and conjure complicated objects, Roxy has to learn to reverse engineer those objects and break them down into their irreducible forms. These forms are, in my mind, one layer of abstraction up from the aspects they're made from, and are forms such as apples, pumpkins, shapes, colors, and so forth. Seeing Roxy learning about this stuff is what made me want to reconsider the crafting system in more depth. If you want to relate what Roxy is doing to what the Grist-based crafting system is doing, we can think in terms of algebra. We're going to go a little farther with this than what I'm about to say, but the basic idea is this. Where the alchemiters are adding positive ideas, Roxy is subtracting negative ideas. Both of these actions result in a net positive, that positive being the sum or product of multiple ideas. Thinking about the alchemy in Homestuck as taking sums or products is more fitting than you might think. Alchemiters manufacture objects from cards with punched holes in them. The combining comes in when one takes two cards and lays them on top of each other, punching a new pattern from the other two. One can either opt to punch only the holes which are shared by both cards, or one can simply punch every hole that either card has. These two options correspond to the two basic logic operations, and or, and if you're familiar at all with Boolean algebra, you know that the math behind this stuff looks borderline identical to that of addition and multiplication with numbers. The alchemiter here is viewing objects as mathematical expressions, that is, the sums and products of smaller ideas. Since not all the kids are void or space players, they have to earn these basic ideas from accomplishing things in the game, which awards them with placeholders for these ideas which it calls Grist. Did you think that Grist was some kind of material which items were made out of? If this were true, why would it be that many smaller objects like books and weapons cost astronomically more Grist than what it takes to make an entire house? You might have never questioned this because on some level it always made perfect sense. Of course Dave's brain in a jar is going to cost way more than John's telescopic sassacrusher. Dave's brain in a jar is way more complicated. But when you stop to realize that this makes sense in a way that is totally different than how building things out of smaller things typically makes sense, you realize just how special that this crafting system really is. Have you ever looked up what the definition of Grist actually is? It sounds like some kind of building material. But according to Merriam-Webster, Grist is a matter of interest or value forming the basis of a story or analysis. And according to Google, Grist is a useful material, especially to back up an argument. Grist is a building material. But it's not used to build physical objects. It's used to build ideas. When you alchemize something, you're essentially making an argument for the idea of that something by setting up smaller ideas in a mathematical expression from which the product represents that something you want to make, and the Grist basically acts as the variables in that expression. When Roxy wants to conjure something, she's going in reverse. She's factoring the object down to its smaller ideas to obtain that same expression, and then snatching the nothingness away from each term to create the same item. In the same conversation with Jade that I keep referring back to, Calliope mentions offhandedly that the aspects come in opposing pairs, similarly to the classes, and in doing so gives away one of them, time and space. From this we're pretty much given immediately another pairing. By knowing that space and void aren't a pairing, at least not in the sense that Calliope is describing, we know contrapositively that light and void are a pair, since space was pretty much the only other reasonable pairing with void. Since you probably aren't too satisfied with that justification, though, let's take a closer look at these and make sure that this pairing makes sense. Depending on the ideas you decide to try and compare, even these two can seem like they aren't exactly opposites. For instance, what does void describe which opposes luck? Hard to say, but if you look at the sheer amount of ideas that do seem to oppose one another, it becomes startling. First, there's the obvious pairing of brightness and darkness. Beyond that, we've seen that light describes knowledge, whereas void describes obfuscation or even ignorance. Where light describes riches, we've seen void describe, well, lack of riches. Where light describes freedom and willpower, we've seen that void describes restraint and submission. And perhaps most interestingly, where light describes plot relevance, void describes, for lack of a better term, plot irrelevance. Hopefully you see now why I think that light and void are obviously one of the opposing pairs that Callie was talking about, but let's try to be a little more descriptive on how exactly they oppose one another. Like I mentioned earlier, in that same conversation, Callie implied that each aspect seems to have an associated color, something for which there's a wealth of evidence for throughout the story. If you look at the colors of the God tier outfits for these two aspects, you'll see the word that we're looking for. Light and void are complementary. The ideas described by these aspects are two sides of the same coin, only fully describing a category of ideas when taken in equal measure. For instance, metafictionally, it seems that light and void together fully describe the narrative's focus, or spotlight. Like a piece of photography, light describes the foreground, void describes the background, but both are required to have a complete picture of the events transpiring. Aside from a possible confirmation that life and doom are a complementary pair in another conversation, we're never told any of the other pairings explicitly in the story, and I'm sure some will even argue that claiming space and time to be a confirmed pair is presumptuous of me. Many readers interpret this as a puzzle challenged by the author, and thoroughly believe that all of the other pairings can be derived with relative certainty from clues in the story. Until about 30 minutes before writing this paragraph, I was one of these people, and furthermore, I thought I had the puzzle solved. After deciding on space/time and light/void, and presuming for lots of obvious reasons that the colors associated with space and time were green and red respectively, I plotted these on a color wheel along with the colors I mentioned for void and light, and attempted to further fill the wheel in with pairings by connecting aspects to colors based on evidence from the comic, which turned into something resembling a game of Sudoku. My thought process unfortunately gets hazy here, but after a while I found myself thoroughly and completely convinced that the remaining four pairings were doom and life, rage and hope, blood and breath, and heart and mind. I still to this moment have legitimately no idea how I arrived at this conclusion. I can't find flaws in my thought process because I can't remember what that thought process was. I originally prepared this video thinking that I would be presenting an infallible case for this being the correct set of pairings, and it wasn't until I started preparing the shitty MS Paint diagrams that I realized things weren't matching up the way I had written it down. Despite not having the infallible evidence I thought I had, I still like these pairings a lot, and I've noticed that, while certainly not the general consensus, these pairings are probably the majority opinion. At the very least, I think that the vast majority of those that don't agree with my pairings will only disagree with one or two of the aspects and agree with the rest. More importantly, I think that the majority also realizes that these official pairings aren't terribly important. I, as well as probably most of you, would like to think that the aspect system is something much more fluid and interconnected than just a set of disconnected pairings of opposites. I believe I've made that opinion clear at this point based on what I said about space and void in part 1, as well as what I said about breath and light in the last video. However, I am going to try to argue that this particular set of pairings, the one that seems to be the best guess at Callie's opposites, is a very special one. I'm going to make note of some of the specific ways that these pairs complement one another, and by the end of part 2, I'll have pointed out what I think are some very interesting and hopefully believable patterns. For those worried that I might be about to dive into a summary of someone else's theory crafting, rest assured that these specific patterns which I'm talking about are ones which I personally haven't ever seen discussed before, and in addition I think that they'll serve to highlight many of the major themes which make Homestuck the incredibly innovative story that it is. But for now, I think we've reached another good stopping point. We only managed to cover one aspect this time, but I'll admit that there might have been a slight bit of bias involved in how long this one took. In the next part, we're going to be getting a little angry. Leave a like and a subscribe if you enjoyed, follow me on Twitter if that's a thing you do, and look out for another video or two from me within the next couple of days. Thanks again for watching.